In this video, we will look at the executions carried out in the United States during the month of January and February. We'll walk through the crimes that put them on death row, the final words they spoke, and the last meals they requested before facing execution. But before we start, let us know in the comments where you are watching this from. On January 28, 2026, after spending more than 26 years on death row, Charles Victor Thompson was executed in Texas. But to understand how he reached that point, we need to go back to 1997, when jealousy and a need for control set off a chain of events that led to a double shooting, a death sentence, a jail escape, and nearly 3 decades on death row. It all started in the summer of 1997 when 27-year-old Chuck started dating Denise, who was 38 years old at the time. Before long, he moved into the home she shared with her son, her co-worker Lisa, and Lisa's 2 daughters. At first, it looked like a fresh start, a blended household trying to make things work, but it didn't stay that way for long. Chuck's jealousy kept growing, and so did his temper. When he got angry, he threw things, kicked the refrigerator, and punched the walls so hard he left holes in them. And it didn't stop there. Chuck rarely worked, leaving Denise and Lisa to carry all the financial weight, and when Lisa finally asked him to help pay the bills, his anger only got worse. One night, Lisa heard him screaming at Denise, and when she peeked into the bedroom, she saw him grabbing and shaking her. Lisa tried to pull him away, but he turned on her instead and threw her to the ground. When she tried to call the police afterward, she discovered the phone line was dead. The cord had been ripped right out of the wall. Not long after, Chuck moved out, while Denise got her own apartment and tried to start over. But the pattern didn't stop. On March 16, 1998, the 3 of them went to a local pub. As the night went on, Chuck became possessive and controlling, demanding that Denise sit with him and not dance with anyone else. And when Lisa saw Denise days later, her face was bruised, her lips split, and there were marks around her neck. By then, though, Denise had already started spending time with Darren, a bartender she had met at a local bar. He was friendly, patient, and well-liked. Everything locals say Chuck wasn't. They were just friends at that time, but Darren could tell something was wrong in Denise's life. On the night of April 29, 1998, he called his best friend Tony to see if he wanted to watch a game, but Tony declined, and the night moved on. But a few hours later, around 2:30 in the morning, Darren called again, this time sounding urgent. He said Denise was being threatened and hurt, and that he was heading to her apartment to help her. But what he didn't know was that he was walking straight into a deadly situation. Early that morning, Chuck showed up at Denise's apartment unannounced, and as soon as he saw Darren, an argument broke out. Denise's neighbor, Catherine, woke up around 3 a.m. to her dog barking and the sound of someone screaming. From inside her home, she heard a woman crying, "Stop!" and "Help!" She immediately called the police and stepped outside to check the apartment numbers, trying to figure out exactly where the commotion was coming from. She saw Denise and Darren standing outside near the apartment. At first glance, neither of them looked physically hurt, but Denise was clearly shaken, talking fast and apologizing to Darren for all of this. Then Chuck came storming out of the apartment. He was yelling and cursing, calling Denise a whore. Darren tried to calm him down, telling him to chill. But instead of backing off, Chuck looked at Darren and yelled, "Do you want to die, motherfucker?" At that point, Deputy William Coker arrived in response to the disturbance call, and he immediately noticed Chuck's face. It was swollen and bruised, a visible sign there had been a fight. And as he started asking questions, it quickly became clear that Chuck was the one who had started it, not the victim. Still, nobody wanted to press charges, and without a formal complaint, there wasn't much he could do. So William did the only thing he could. He ordered Chuck to leave the complex, then followed him as he drove away, and warned him that if he came back, it wouldn't be just a fight anymore. It would be criminal trespass. And with that, he left, thinking the situation had been resolved. But he was wrong, very wrong. Because just a couple of hours later, around 6 a.m., Chuck came back, and this time he wasn't there to talk. He was armed with a 9mm handgun, and he was ready to use it. Chuck walked up to the front door of Denise's apartment and kicked it in. The door blew open, waking Darren and Denise. But before either of them could fully react, Chuck was already in the bedroom, standing over them with the gun raised. He fired 4 shots into Darren's neck and chest at close range. The bullets tore through his vital organs, and Darren collapsed instantly and died within seconds.
The gentleman was there in bed with her. So we got into a verbal altercation, and one thing led to another. Now, what happened next it's kind of a blur to me. I'm still hungover and still a little drunk, but one thing led to another. The first shot was from over 6 to 8 feet away. It's just a big blur after that. She got in the middle of us fighting. It happened so fast.
Then Chuck turned to Denise. She screamed and tried to get away, but there was nowhere to go. Chuck told her, "I can shoot you too, bitch." While he reloaded, aimed, and fired. The bullet hit her in the face, entering through her cheek. It shattered her dentures, nearly severed her tongue, and caused catastrophic internal damage. Denise dropped to the floor, badly hurt, but somehow she was still alive. At that exact moment, Catherine's son was heading out the door for school when he heard the gunshots. And not long after, Catherine heard pounding on her front door. When she stepped outside, she saw Denise on the ground, struggling to breathe and unable to speak. Denise lifted her hands and mimicked someone firing a gun, desperately trying to show Catherine what had just happened. When Deputy William Coker rushed back to the apartment complex, the calm from earlier was gone. Now it was chaos. William knelt beside Denise and asked, "Did Chuck shoot you?" And Denise nodded. When William looked up, Chuck was nowhere in sight. He had already fled the scene. On his way out, he tossed the gun into a nearby creek and tried to disappear. But he didn't go very far. Instead, he drove to the home of a friend, Diane Zernia, arriving as she was getting her daughter ready for school. She let him in, and Chuck sat down in the living room. You might expect him to be pacing, panicking, but instead he did something almost unreal. He fell asleep. After Diane's daughter left for school, the house went quiet. Diane turned on the news, and that's when she saw it. A story about the shooting at Denise's apartment. She sat there watching while Chuck slept just a few feet away. Then, hours later, he finally woke up. Trying to break the tension, Diane made a joke about his black eye and said, "I hope the other guy looks worse." And Chuck answered, "He does. I shot him." He later called his father and told him what had happened. His father convinced him to turn himself in, and that same morning, Chuck walked into the police station and was arrested on the spot, initially charged with manslaughter. Back at the apartment, paramedics had done everything they could. Darren was already gone, while Denise was barely clinging to life. She was airlifted to Herman Hospital, where doctors struggled to save her. The gunshot had severely damaged her airway, and swelling made it hard to get a breathing tube in place. Despite all their efforts, Denise's body was failing, and she slipped into a coma. A week later, with no hope of recovery, her family made the heartbreaking decision to remove life support. Denise died on May 6, 1998. Chuck didn't know it yet, but Denise's death would change everything for him. At his trial in 1999, Chuck admitted that he was the one who fired the shots. He didn't deny that. But his defense argued something unusual. They said that Denise's death wasn't actually Chuck's fault. According to them, the hospital was to blame. Their medical expert, Dr. Paul Radalat, testified that the staff at Herman Hospital made serious mistakes placing her breathing tube and that Denise went without oxygen for 5 to 10 minutes. That lack of oxygen, he said, caused brain damage and led to the decision to take her off life support. If the hospital hadn't made those mistakes, the defense claimed, Denise might have survived, and Chuck would only be facing life in prison. But the prosecution hit back hard. The medical examiner and lead surgeon testified that Denise's wound was so severe that she was in immediate danger from the moment she was shot. Her tongue had been nearly severed, and that injury alone, they explained, was life-threatening. Even Dr. Radalat eventually admitted on cross-examination that Denise probably would have died without any medical treatment. Legally, that mattered. A lot. Under Texas law, a person can be held criminally responsible for a death if it wouldn't have happened but for their actions. In this case, the jury was asked a simple but crucial question. Would Denise have been in that hospital fighting for her life if Chuck hadn't shot her in the face? And their answer was clear. They concluded that it was Chuck's decision to pull the trigger and not anything the hospital did that was the true cause of her death. And because of that, he was eligible for the ultimate punishment. And on April 14, 1999, he received his final verdict. Charles Victor Thompson was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. During the sentencing phase, the prosecution had presented evidence that Chuck posed a future danger to society, and they had proof. While Chuck was being held in the Harris County Jail awaiting trial, he didn't lay low. Instead, he approached other inmates with a disturbing request. He wanted someone to kill Diane Zernia, the friend he had confessed to after the shooting. She could directly link him to the crime, and he wanted her silenced, permanently. An undercover investigator named Gary Johnson posed as a hitman and met with Chuck in a visitor's booth, wearing a hidden wire.
I just need to get rid of her. She's the state's witness. She's the only witness they got. Okay.
During their recorded conversation, Chuck offered him $1,500 to retrieve the gun from the creek and murder Diane. He even drew a map to her house, described her family, her vehicles, and even the layout of her home, all to help this hitman carry out the job. The evidence was devastating. Chuck wasn't just a man who had killed, he was trying to arrange another murder from behind bars. In 2001, however, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals ruled that the undercover operation violated his Sixth Amendment rights, and they overturned his death sentence. A new sentencing trial was ordered. So, in 2005, prosecutors had to prove Chuck's future dangerousness all over again, this time without the undercover testimony. They called another jailhouse witness, Robin Rhodes, who testified that Chuck had given him a hit list of witnesses and told him to either kill them or convince them not to testify. Even though the defense attacked Robin as a full-time informant who had worked with law enforcement in over 50 cases, the jury believed him. And on October 28, 2005, Chuck was sentenced to death for the second time. But Chuck wasn't finished yet. Just days after receiving his second death sentence, he pulled off one of the most audacious jail escapes in Texas history.
A dragnet over Houston as police search for a convicted killer, a death row inmate who, they say, simply walked out of jail in Houston. How?
Thompson smuggled street clothes that he wore for a court appearance back to his jail cell and then found a way to change in a booth like this one, a booth used for meetings between attorneys and inmates.
On November 3, 2005, Chuck was still being held in the Harris County Jail, waiting to be transferred to death row at the Polunsky Unit in Livingston. But what no one knew was that he had been planning his escape for weeks. Inmates were allowed to keep a legal binder in their cells, and Chuck used his like a toolkit. Hidden inside were a handcuff key, a fake ID badge, and a full set of civilian clothes, khaki pants, a dark blue shirt, and white tennis shoes. That afternoon, Chuck told guards he had a meeting with his attorney. They escorted him to a visitor room, cuffed like any other inmate. But once he was alone, he slipped out of the handcuffs, changed clothes, and walked toward the exit. As he reached the jail's security checkpoints, guards stopped him just like they were supposed to. But Chuck didn't panic. He flashed the fake ID badge, which claimed he was a state investigator with the Attorney General's office, and, unbelievably, it worked. He repeated this 4 times, bluffing his way past guard after guard until he reached the front entrance. Then, just like that, he stepped through the door of a maximum security jail in broad daylight, and no one stopped him. Later, even he admitted he couldn't believe it. "I was stunned that I made it out without being swarmed by deputies," he told reporters. Once he was free, Chuck hopped onto a freight train heading toward East Texas, spent the night in an open boxcar, then made his way to Shreveport, Louisiana. There, he stole a bike and pretended to be a Hurricane Katrina evacuee to get money from strangers, planning to collect enough cash to reach Canada. But he didn't make it. On November 6th, just 3 days after his escape, Chuck's freedom came to an end. Acting on a tip, police found Chuck intoxicated at a payphone outside a liquor store in Shreveport. He was trying to call friends overseas to arrange a wire transfer. He was arrested without a fight and sent back to Texas. For the next 20 years, Chuck sat on death row at the Polunsky unit, filing appeal after appeal, arguing ineffective counsel, improper evidence, and constitutional violations. But every court upheld the verdict and the sentence. Then, in 2021, the U.S. Supreme Court denied his final appeal. There were no more options left. On September 11, 2025, his death warrant was signed. His execution was scheduled for January 28, 2026. It would be the first execution under the leadership of Harris County District Attorney Sean Tier. For the families of Denise Hayslip and Darren Kane, the wait had been long and painful. 27 years had passed since that brutal night. When the death warrant was signed, friends and family of Darren were in the courtroom, and according to the prosecutor, they had been looking forward to this day very much. In the weeks leading up to his scheduled execution, Chuck gave interviews from death row and expressed deep remorse for what he had done. "It's tragic what happened," he said. "I regret it. I have remorse. I want people to be able to heal and move past it. I pray for them, and I've asked them to forgive me." But he also continued to insist that the hospital had some responsibility for Denise's death. "If she had survived, my maximum sentence would have been life in prison," he said. On September 11th, Chuck was moved to Death Watch, an isolated cell at the Polunsky unit with a toilet, a sink, a metal bed, and a camera monitoring him 24 hours a day. 2 hours of recreation, 5 days a week. That was his life now. Chuck talked to his parents often, but they hadn't visited in person in years. He had a daughter, now 34, and a son, 31. He and his daughter had stayed close. But in his final days, it wasn't family sitting with him. It was his pen pals. The day before his execution, one supporter sat with him in the visiting room for 9 hours, and when the sun came up on January 28th, they came back. They were there by 8 a.m., sitting with him again, while everyone waited on a last-minute ruling from the Court of Criminal Appeals. Even with a few hours left to live, he was calm, steady, and still holding on to hope. Outside the prison, his pen pals were refreshing court dockets and news feeds. But the stay never came. The preparations continued. Under Texas law, inmates can no longer request a special last meal. He was offered a meal from the day's prison menu that featured fried chicken, scrambled eggs, and other items. By 6 p.m., he was strapped to the gurney. In his final words, Chuck turned to the families of his victims and asked them to find it in their hearts to forgive him, saying he hoped they could begin to heal and move past this. "There are no winners in this situation," he said, after a spiritual advisor prayed over him for several minutes and just before the lethal dose of pentobarbital was administered. He told the witnesses that his execution creates more victims and traumatizes more people 28 years later. "I'm sorry for what I did. I'm sorry for what happened," he added. "And I want to tell all of y'all I love you and to keep Jesus in your life. Keep Jesus first." As the injection began to take effect, Chuck took a series of heavy breaths, then grew quiet and still. He was pronounced dead 22 minutes after the drug started flowing. Charles Victor Thompson was 55 years old. The next execution took place in February in Florida. On February 10, 2026, after spending more than 35 years on death row, Ronald Palmer Heath was executed by lethal injection. Ronnie was just 16 years old when he killed for the first time. His first victim was a man named Michael Lee Green. Ronnie stabbed him 23 times, crushed his skull, and burned his car. He was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 30 years, of which he served only 10. And when he got out in 1988, everyone assumed he had learned his lesson. But he hadn't. 6 months after his release, Ronnie killed again. But to understand what happened, we need to go back to May 1989 and a man named Michael Sheridan. Michael was 33 years old, a traveling salesman from out of town with a family back home waiting for him. This was supposed to be a routine business trip in Gainesville, Florida. By all accounts, Michael was outgoing and easy to talk to, the kind of guy who would strike up a conversation with anyone. On the evening of May 23, 1989, Michael walked into the Purple Porpoise Lounge, a bar near the University of Florida campus. He was already a few drinks in and feeling social. But what Michael didn't know was that his friendliness was about to cost him his life. Because sitting in a booth just a few feet away were two brothers, and one of them had already killed before. Ronald Palmer Heath was 28, and his younger brother Kenneth was 24. Kenneth struck up a conversation with Michael. They talked about baseball, about life, about nothing in particular. Michael was friendly, generous even, and then he made a gesture that would seal his fate. He offered to buy them drinks. And by the end of the night, Michael had paid the entire bar tab for both brothers with his credit card. Eventually, Michael asked Kenneth a simple question. "Do you get high? Do you have any marijuana?" Kenneth told him that his brother Ronnie did, but here's the thing about Ronnie. He wasn't just making small talk. He was watching, calculating. Michael was wearing gold chains, a watch, and a bracelet. He was clearly drunk, he was alone, and he had just shown that he had money. Ronnie pulled Kenneth aside and made a suggestion. If they could get Michael to leave with them, they could rob him. And Kenneth agreed, just like that. The three men left the Purple Porpoise together shortly after midnight. They got into Kenneth's car, with Ronnie behind the wheel, and drove out of town. Michael thought they were going somewhere to smoke marijuana. He thought he was making friends. He had no idea what was really about to happen. Ronnie drove them to a remote dirt road in Alachua County, far from any houses or street lights. They parked, got out of the car, and lit a joint. Michael was relaxed, unsuspecting. But then Ronnie made a gesture, a motion with his hand, like he was holding a gun, and he said to Kenneth, "Did you get it?" Kenneth knew exactly what he meant. He reached under the car seat and pulled out a small caliber handgun. He pointed it directly at Michael and told him he was being robbed. He ordered Michael to hand over his wallet and remove his jewelry. Michael looked at them in disbelief. "Y'all aren't serious, are you?" But they were. And when Michael refused to comply, when he said he wasn't going to give them anything, Kenneth pulled the trigger. The bullet hit Michael in the chest. He stumbled backward and sat down on the ground, clutching his wound, and he said that it hurt. But Ronnie wasn't done. He walked over to Michael and demanded his wallet, his chains, his watch. And when Michael started to reach for his belongings, Ronnie began kicking him, hard and repeatedly, as he lay wounded on the ground. Ronnie stripped Michael of everything, his wallet, his gold chains, his watch, but there was one piece of jewelry he couldn't find, a bracelet he had seen earlier. Ronnie told Michael, "You give me the bracelet and we'll get you to a hospital." But Michael couldn't give it. Either he didn't have it or he couldn't reach it in his condition. Frustrated, Ronnie walked back to the car, and when he returned, he was holding a hunting knife. He walked up to Michael and stabbed him in the neck. He tried to slit his throat, jabbing the blade in and attempting to cut, but the knife wasn't sharp enough. It didn't work. So Ronnie turned to Kenneth and gave him an order. "Shoot him in the head." Kenneth fired twice. 2 bullets entered Michael's skull from the front, just above his left eyebrow. And that was it. Michael collapsed and died there in the dirt, all for a watch, some chains, and a wallet. But the brothers weren't done. They picked up Michael's body and carried it deeper into the woods, dumping it where they hoped it wouldn't be found for a long time. Ronnie wiped the knife clean and put it back in the car. Then they drove back to the Purple Porpoise. Michael's rental car was still sitting in the parking lot. Ronnie handed Kenneth the keys and told him to follow. They drove the rental car to another remote dirt road, removed some items from the vehicle, cut the gas line, and set it on fire. They left the knife inside the burning car, letting the flames consume the evidence. The next day, May 24, 1989, Ronnie and Kenneth went shopping like nothing had happened. They drove to the Oaks Mall in Gainesville and spent the day buying clothes, shoes, and other items using Michael's stolen credit cards. Ronnie told Kenneth to sign all the receipts because, he said, Kenneth's handwriting was better and he might mess up if he did it himself. The brothers spent that night in Gainesville and continued their shopping spree the next morning. But their luck ran out when a clerk at an audio store became suspicious and started asking questions about the card they couldn't answer. Ronnie and Kenneth quickly left the store and drove back to Jacksonville. On the way, they stopped at the St. Johns River and threw the handgun into the water. It was never recovered. Ronnie returned to the trailer in Douglas, Georgia, where he lived with his girlfriend, Penny Powell, and for a few weeks it seemed like he had gotten away with it. But he was wrong. Michael's body was found 6 days after he was killed, on May 30th. It was in an advanced state of decomposition. The medical examiner, Dr. William Frank Hamilton, estimated that Michael had been dead for 3 to 10 days. He observed 3 gunshot wounds, 2 to the head and 1 to the torso, along with a sharp force injury to the neck. The wound to the torso alone was fatal, though not immediately. But it was the combination of the gunshot wounds and the stabbing that ultimately caused Michael's death. Investigators traced the credit card purchases back to the brothers, and store clerks identified Kenneth from photo lineups. Even though Ronnie was the one who had orchestrated the entire crime, the receipts all had Kenneth's signature. Several weeks after the murder, police arrested Ronnie at his trailer in Georgia, and when they searched it, they found multiple items purchased with Michael's credit cards. But there was one piece of evidence that would seal Ronnie's fate: Michael's stolen watch, the one Ronnie had ripped off a dying man's wrist. Both Ronnie and Kenneth were charged with first-degree murder, armed robbery, and multiple forgery-related charges. After his arrest, Kenneth made a deal. He agreed to testify against his older brother in exchange for a reduced sentence. In 1990, he pleaded guilty to all charges and received life in prison without eligibility for parole for 25 years. The judge's sentencing order noted that Kenneth had acted under the power of his older brother. Kenneth Heath remains in prison to this day. Ronnie went to trial in 1990, and the prosecution presented overwhelming evidence: the credit card receipts, the testimony of store clerks who identified Kenneth, the stolen watch found in Ronnie's trailer, and most damning of all, Kenneth's detailed testimony about what happened that night. Kenneth admitted to pulling the trigger, but he painted a clear picture. Ronnie was the mastermind. Ronnie had suggested the robbery. Ronnie had driven to the remote location. Ronnie had kicked and stabbed Michael as he lay wounded. And Ronnie had ordered Kenneth to shoot Michael in the head. The defense tried to argue that Kenneth was the more culpable party, that Ronnie had only played a secondary role, but the jury didn't buy it. They found him guilty of first-degree murder, armed robbery, conspiracy to commit forgery, 7 counts of forgery, and 7 counts of uttering a forgery. During the penalty phase, the jury heard about Ronnie's violent past, his conviction for second-degree murder at age 16, his decade in prison, and his release just 6 months before this crime. The prosecution argued that he posed a continuing danger to society, that he had been given a second chance and had immediately returned to violence. The jury voted 10-2 to recommend the death penalty, and without hesitation, the judge agreed. Ronald Palmer Heath was sentenced to die in Florida's electric chair. For the next 35 years, Ronnie sat on death row, filing appeal after appeal. His lawyers argued that the jury's non-unanimous recommendation violated his constitutional rights, that Kenneth's testimony had been incentivized and unreliable, and that the disparity between his sentence and Kenneth's, who had actually pulled the trigger, was fundamentally unfair. But every court that reviewed his case upheld the conviction and sentence. And in 2026, his time was up. On February 10th, Ronnie's final day came. He woke up at 5:07 a.m. in his cell at Florida State Prison. In nearly every letter he wrote while on death watch, Ronnie asked the same thing: "Please look after my mother." Later that day, two people came to say goodbye, his mother and a friend. He did not meet with a spiritual advisor, and when officials offered him a special last meal, he declined. After 35 years on death row, Ronnie ate the same standard tray as every other inmate. At 6 p.m., the curtain to the execution chamber went up. Ronnie was already strapped to the gurney, an IV line inserted in his arm. The warden asked if he had any final words. Ronnie looked up and said, "I'm sorry, that's all I can say. Thank you." 35 years, and that was all he had. As the drugs began flowing, Ronnie showed little reaction. He closed his eyes, his breathing slowed, and then he was still. About 8 minutes later, a medic was called in. 2 minutes after that, at 6:12 p.m., Ronald Palmer Heath was pronounced dead. He was 64 years old. Just 2 days later, the next execution was carried out, this time in Oklahoma. On February 12, 2026, after spending more than 18 years on death row, Kendrick Antonio Simpson was executed by lethal injection in Oklahoma. But the reason he ended up like this? Someone said something about his hat. That's all it took. A passing comment about a Chicago Cubs baseball cap inside a hip-hop club in Oklahoma City. By the end of that night, 2 men were dead, shot with an AK-47 on a highway, and a third barely survived. But this wasn't just a nightclub shooting. What investigators later uncovered about Kendrick's past made this case one of the most disturbing on Oklahoma's death row. This is what he did. It was the evening of January 15, 2006. 26-year-old Kendrick and 2 friends, Jonathan Dalton and Latango Robertson, were getting ready to go out to Fritzy's, a hip-hop club in Oklahoma City. But before they left, they stopped at Kendrick's house so he could change clothes. And while he was inside, Kendrick grabbed something else, an AK-47 assault rifle. The 3 men drove to a house party first, where they spent hours drinking alcohol and using drugs. They didn't arrive at Fritzy's until sometime between midnight and 1 a.m. on January 16th. And once inside, Kendrick and Jonathan took ecstasy and got drinks. Jonathan and Latango sat down at a table while Kendrick walked around the club. As he moved through the crowd, he walked past 3 men he didn't know: London Johnson, Anthony Jones, and Glenn Palmer. They were close friends, had known each other since they were kids. Glenn was 20 years old, and Anthony was just 19. And as Kendrick passed them, one of them said something about the Chicago Cubs baseball cap he was wearing. It was a passing comment, nothing serious. But Kendrick didn't take it that way. He went back to his table and told Jonathan and Latango that some guy had given him a hard time about his cap. Then he approached the 3 men again. This time, his tone was different. He told them he was going to chop them up, street slang for shooting them with a chopper, an AK-47. It was a direct threat, and the 3 men heard it loud and clear. But a few moments later, he walked up to Glenn, acted like nothing happened, extended his hand and said, "We cool?" But Glenn didn't buy it. He hit Kendrick in the mouth, knocking him to the floor. Kendrick got up, walked back to his friends, and told them he wanted to leave. The 3 men left the club and ended up at a 7-Eleven on Northwest 23rd Street with some girls they had been talking to in the parking lot. And as they sat in their Monte Carlo, another car pulled into the lot, a Chevy Caprice. Inside that Caprice were London, Anthony, and Glenn. Kendrick recognized Glenn immediately as the one who had hit him at Fritzy's. Jonathan told Kendrick to chill out, but Kendrick wasn't listening. What happened next would be the reason he spent the rest of his life behind bars. When Glenn drove out of the parking lot and merged onto Interstate 44, Kendrick told Jonathan to follow them. As they drove behind the Caprice, Kendrick turned to Latango in the back seat and told him to hand over the gun. Latango hesitated, but Kendrick made it clear if he had to reach back and get it himself, there would be trouble. Glenn exited the interstate onto Pennsylvania Avenue, and Jonathan followed. As they drove down Pennsylvania, Jonathan pulled the Monte Carlo into the left lane beside the Caprice. Glenn was driving, Anthony was in the front passenger seat and London was in the back. And then Kendrick pointed the assault rifle out the open window and started firing. The shots came fast, about 20 rounds in rapid succession. London heard the gunfire and immediately dropped to the floor of the car. He didn't see the shooter, but he saw the white vehicle pull up beside them, and he heard the bullets tearing into the car. The Caprice jumped the curb, hit an electric pole and a fence, and came to a stop. Glenn had been shot in the chest, while Anthony took rounds to the side of his head and torso. Anthony was unconscious, but Glenn wasn't. He was still awake. He knew he had been shot, and he was terrified the shooters were going to come back and finish the job. London, trapped in the back seat with his dying friends, tried to give them CPR, but Glenn's breathing grew heavier and slower, and London could only sit there and watch as his best friend slipped away. London flagged down a passing car and asked the driver to get help, but by the time paramedics arrived, it was too late. Glenn and Anthony died right there on Pennsylvania Avenue. They had walked into that club a few hours earlier with their whole lives ahead of them, not knowing they would be dead hours later, all because of a dispute over a baseball cap. Meanwhile, back in the Monte Carlo, Kendrick said, "I'm a monster, I just shot the car up." But then he added, "They shouldn't play with me like that." Jonathan kept driving until they reached his house in Midwest City. There, they dropped off the gun, switched cars, and went to meet the girls from Fritzy's, acting like nothing had happened. But the police quickly identified Kendrick as the shooter, and Latango and Jonathan were arrested as accessories. Both eventually pleaded guilty and were sentenced to 20 years in prison. They served 6 years each before being released. Kendrick wouldn't get away that easy, though. During his trial in 2007, prosecutors weren't offering any deals. They made it clear from the start that in their eyes only one sentence would be enough: death. But this wasn't the first time Kendrick had pointed a gun at someone and pulled the trigger, and what came out during sentencing changed how the jury saw everything. The defense argued Kendrick suffered from severe PTSD, that he had magnified the threat from Glenn and the others because he was hypervigilant and paranoid. And to understand why, they took the jury back to the beginning. Kendrick, who fled to Oklahoma as a Hurricane Katrina refugee in 2005, was born in New Orleans in 1980. He grew up surrounded by drugs and violence. He was sexually assaulted as a child, and when he turned 16, a friend asked him to kill a government witness. Kendrick refused, and because of that refusal, the friend ambushed him and shot him 5 times. He spent 2 months in the hospital, much of it in a coma. And over the next 7 months, he underwent 16 surgeries. The trauma left him paranoid and hypervigilant, and a psychologist diagnosed him with PTSD. But the jury would later hear something during sentencing that made the PTSD defense almost irrelevant. Before the murders at Fritzy's, Kendrick and 2 other men had forced their way into the home of a man named Hung Pham. Kendrick had shoved a gun in Hung's face, then beat him with it, and forced him into a bathroom closet, demanding money. But when Hung told them there was nothing left, Kendrick raised the gun and shot him in the head at point-blank range. Then the 3 men walked out, leaving Hung on the bathroom floor, bleeding and unconscious. Against all odds, Hung survived. Kendrick was convicted for that robbery and sentenced to 7.5 years in prison. But he was released early, just months before the night at Fritzy's. Now, in the sentencing phase of the murder trial, Hung Pham took the stand. He described how Kendrick had beaten him with a gun and shot him in the head. "He hurt me a lot," he said. "I remember forever." The prosecution also called a jailhouse informant named Roy Collins. Roy testified that Kendrick had tried to hire him to kill London and assault 2 pregnant women who were state witnesses. He said Kendrick would smile and laugh when talking about the murders and thought he was a gangster, like Tupac or Biggie Smalls. And that Kendrick told him he couldn't believe the victims' families were crying because the victims were bangers. That's the life they lived, that's the life they chose. The jury found him guilty of first-degree murder for both Glenn Palmer and Anthony Jones, as well as discharging a firearm with intent to kill London Johnson. They found 4 aggravating factors. Kendrick had a prior violent felony conviction. He had knowingly created a great risk of death to more than one person. The murders were especially heinous, atrocious, or cruel, and there was a probability that he would commit future acts of violence. They voted unanimously to recommend the death penalty, and the judge agreed. Kendrick Antonio Simpson was sentenced to die by lethal injection. For the next 18 years, Kendrick sat on death row at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester, and during that time, something changed, or so they said. He earned his GED, took college courses, and became an award-winning poet. He also maintained close relationships with his family, including his sons, who said he had stayed a part of their lives despite being in prison. Over those 18 years, Kendrick came to terms with what he had done. "I'm responsible for their deaths," he said. "I don't make any excuses. I don't blame others, and they didn't deserve what happened to them. I'm ashamed of causing much pain and hurt, the type of pain and hurt that lives forever." But none of that changed what happened, and in 2026, his death warrant was signed. On January 14th, Kendrick appeared before the Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board via video conference from death row.
"I'm ashamed of my actions. I'm ashamed of the destruction my actions caused. I'm ashamed of being a murderer."
He also added, "I'm not the worst of the worst. I'm not a monster." Remember what he said in that car 18 years earlier? "I'm a monster." Now he stood before the board saying, "I'm not a monster." Whether the change was real or performed, only he knows. But the victims' families were also there, and they saw it differently. "He was literally a monster in that nightclub looking for somebody's life to take," said Crystal Allison, Glenn's sister. "My brothers meant the world to me. They were the stars of the family. They were the center of our family." London Johnson, the sole survivor, told the board,
"Part of me died in that car as well. Those were my best friends, my brothers."
He added, "So many endless tears and sleepless nights of images of my friends laying there bleeding out, suffering." But Kendrick's attorney asked for mercy.
Kendrick's trauma does not absolve him from his responsibility. I think it does provide context for the actions and a reason for compassion.
The board voted 3-2 to deny clemency, and Governor Kevin Stitt upheld the decision.
Clemency is denied.
The execution would proceed as scheduled. What do you think? Did Kendrick deserve a second chance, or was the death penalty the right call? On February 12, 2026, his final day came. For his last meal, Kendrick requested a bacon cheeseburger, large onion rings, and a strawberry milkshake. Just before 10 a.m., he was strapped to the gurney. When asked for his final words, he looked at the people who had come to support him and said, "Love y'all. Thanks for being here to support me. That's it." He didn't say anything about Glenn. He didn't say anything about Anthony. And he didn't say a word to their families. His spiritual advisor began reading from the Bible. Kendrick closed his eyes. Then he opened them one last time, looked at his supporters, smiled, and gave them a thumbs up. He was given a 3-drug lethal injection. The first, a sedative. The second, to stop his breathing. And the third, to stop his heart. By 10:12, he was unconscious. 2 tears fell from his left eye and rolled over the 2 teardrop tattoos on his cheek. He was pronounced dead at 10:19 a.m. Kendrick Antonio Simpson was 45 years old. The last execution of the month took place on February 24th. After spending almost 40 years on death row, Melvin Trotter was executed by lethal injection in Florida. But the reason he ended up there? $100. He walked into a 70-year-old woman's grocery store, left her for dead on the floor of her own shop, and walked out with $100 and some food stamps. But the woman he left behind? She wasn't dead. And the one mistake he made walking through that door? It was right there on his chest the entire time. It was a Monday afternoon, June 16, 1986. 70-year-old Virgie Langford was alone inside Langford's grocery store in Palmetto, Florida. She had owned and operated the store for years. It was her livelihood, her identity, and a fixture in the community. The last customer had gone for the day, and the store was quiet. But someone was watching. 25-year-old Melvin Trotter had been waiting outside for exactly this moment. Melvin was already on community control, a form of strict supervised release for a prior robbery and burglary conviction. But it didn't seem like he had learned his lesson. He was broke, and he was addicted, and he needed money, fast. He was wearing a Tropicana employee badge with the name Melvin on it, his own first name, right there on his chest. And as soon as the last customer was gone, he walked inside. He immediately grabbed Virgie by the neck and forced her toward the back of the store. He reached for a 16-inch butcher knife taken from the store itself and stabbed her 7 times. He cut 8 inches deep into her abdomen, disemboweling her. But Virgie was still conscious, and while she lay there, bleeding on the floor of her own store, Melvin walked to the register, emptied it, and left. But how he spent the next few hours and what Virgie did before she died is what eventually put him on death row. A woman named Eleanor Oates later testified that she saw Melvin running from the direction of Langford's store that afternoon. He asked her where to buy cocaine. She went with him to buy it, and the two of them went back to his mother's house, where they spent the rest of the afternoon smoking and watching television. Oates said that Melvin had money and food stamps tied up in a red bandana, and when she asked where he got them, he told her he had gotten the money for doing a job. Meanwhile, a truck driver walked into Langford's grocery and found Virgie lying on the floor, bleeding. She was rushed to the hospital and taken into emergency surgery. And despite everything she had just been through, she was conscious long enough to describe her attacker to police, including the Tropicana badge with the name Melvin on it. But the damage was too severe. Hours after surgery, Virgie Langford died of cardiac arrest. She was 70 years old. The police moved quickly. With Virgie's description and the name on the badge, investigators identified Melvin Trotter as a suspect. They searched his home and found a T-shirt stained with blood matching Virgie's type. And at the store, forensic teams lifted a handprint from the meat cooler that matched his. He was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, robbery with a deadly weapon, and burglary. But what came out at trial about the life that led him to that store would divide the jury and then do something the defense never expected. Melvin was born as the result of rape. He never knew his father, and his mother was an alcoholic who was physically abusive and emotionally absent. When he was 9 years old, the state stepped in and placed him in foster care. But that didn't bring stability. His foster father was eventually jailed for aggravated battery, leaving Melvin to be raised solely by his foster mother. The one bright spot in his life was his sister, the only close family relationship he ever had. But when Melvin was in his late teens, she was shot and killed. Whatever anchor he had left was gone. After his arrest, a psychiatrist evaluated Melvin and found an IQ of 72, placing him in the range of a slow learner. The psychiatrist concluded that Melvin had impaired common sense, couldn't plan ahead, and struggled to understand the consequences of his own behavior. He noted that Melvin wouldn't typically become violent unless he felt he was in danger, and that his cocaine use could distort his sense of reality. Another expert later calculated Melvin's mental age at the time of the crime as 12 years and 8 months. His attorneys laid all of it out in front of the jury. But underneath the sympathy was a detail that complicated everything. The state had already tried to help him. Melvin had a prior conviction for robbery and burglary, and instead of sending him to prison, the courts placed him on community control, supervised release. That Tropicana job, the one whose badge he wore into Langford's store, he had gotten while he was on it. The system gave him a second chance. He used both the freedom and the badge to find a 70-year-old woman alone in a store. At trial in May 1987, the jury found him guilty on all counts. The trial court found several mitigating factors, including his below-average IQ, his history of developmental problems, that he was under extreme emotional disturbance, and that he had shown remorse. But the jury still recommended death by a vote of 9-3. The judge agreed, citing 4 aggravating circumstances. Melvin was under community control at the time of the murder. He had a prior violent felony conviction. The murder was committed during a robbery, and the crime was especially heinous, atrocious, and cruel. But a ruling from Florida's Supreme Court was about to change everything, at least for a while. On appeal, the Florida Supreme Court ruled in Melvin's favor. They found that community control was not the same as a sentence of imprisonment under the law, which meant one of the aggravating factors shouldn't have been used. They threw out his death sentence and ordered a new sentencing hearing. But then something unusual happened. Before the new hearing could even be scheduled, the Florida legislature changed the law to specifically include community control as an aggravating factor. Exactly the factor the Supreme Court had just ruled couldn't be used against Melvin. Now it could. And at the resentencing, members of Virgie's family took the stand. They described who she was, what she meant to her community, and the kind of person she had been. A warm and loving person. The new jury heard all of it. And this time, the result was even more decisive. They recommended death by a vote of 11-1. Melvin's attorneys appealed again, arguing the new law had been applied retroactively and violated his constitutional rights. And the Florida Supreme Court did something they almost never do. They reversed their own earlier ruling, the one that had saved Melvin's life, and declared that the original trial had been error-free all along. The decision that had spared him? They took it back. His death sentence stood. What do you think? Did Melvin deserve to be executed, or should his background have been enough to spare his life? Let us know in the comments. For nearly 40 years, Melvin Trotter sat on Florida's death row. In all that time, he received a single disciplinary write-up. Just one, for spoken threats in 1995. Other than that, nothing. He was one of the longest-serving inmates on the row. Then, on January 23, 2026, Governor Ron DeSantis signed his death warrant. Melvin's attorneys immediately filed appeals. They challenged Florida's lethal injection protocol, arguing the Department of Corrections had repeatedly used expired drugs, prepared incorrect dosages, and administered drugs outside the written protocol. According to the state's own records, the department had used expired etomidate in at least 4 executions in 2025. His lawyers asked the courts to stay the execution until an independent investigation could be conducted. They also argued that executing a 65-year-old man amounted to cruel and unusual punishment. Florida law provides enhanced protections for people over 65 in nearly every other legal context. But when it comes to the death penalty, the state makes no exception. The Florida Supreme Court rejected both arguments. They ruled that Melvin had failed to prove the lethal injection posed a substantial risk of needless suffering, and that age-based exemptions only apply to people who were under 18 at the time of their crime. For the family of Virgie Langford, none of that mattered. On June 16, 1986, a man walked into her store and took everything for $100 and a few food stamps, tied up in a red bandana. On February 24, 2026, Melvin's final day came. He woke up at 3:20 in the morning, and according to the Department of Corrections, he remained compliant throughout the day. He had one visitor, but did not meet with a spiritual advisor. For his last meal, Melvin requested fish, rice, cornbread, an omelet, cake, and a soda. At 6 p.m., the curtain to the execution chamber went up. Melvin was already strapped to the gurney, an IV line inserted in his arm. When asked for his final words, Melvin declined to give a statement. No apology, no explanation. Then, 2 minutes later, the drugs began to flow. Within minutes, his breathing grew heavy. His body twitched. And then it slowed. The warden walked over, checked his face, and shouted his name. There was no reaction. A medic was called in at 6:14. Melvin Trotter was pronounced dead at 6:15 p.m. He was 65 years old. That concludes all executions carried out in January and February 2026. If you liked this video, make sure to check out the next one because just when you thought it couldn't get worse, well, it can. And the next cases are even more disturbing.